Hello everybody, welcome to our next lecture. Today I want to talk about the history of psychology, and I want to do the fast version, or like I like to say, the history of psychology on crack, or the history of psychology on meth. I want to whip through some of the important developments in the last 120, 130 years or so. We defined psychology in a previous lecture as the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. And so I wanted to just come back to that definition for a second. We talked about how psychology strives to be scientific. Again, the practice of psychology in terms of, say, therapy or counseling or teaching is more of an art than a science, but all of those practical applied areas of psychology should rest upon a foundation of knowledge, objectively obtained knowledge through established methods such as the scientific method. We rely on observation and the data that come from observations of all kind, including in the laboratory. And so we want a scientific foundation. Otherwise, the whole field just rests upon opinion, this person's opinion or that person's opinion. And as you know, opinion is not a very valid way to go. Behavior would simply be everything outside of us. We can clearly observe our own behavior, observe other people's behavior. But generally speaking, it's anything that's measurable outside of us. And the hardest thing to study in psychology is clearly the inner life that you and I inhabit, our thoughts and our motivations, our feelings, our subjective experiences. And it's a challenge to study these things, but it's nonetheless part of the field. So when we put all these together, we have the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Now, in terms of the history of psychology, we have to make some observations here. The first is that psychology as a field is basically the combination of two areas of study that preceded the establishment of the field of psychology in 1879. And those two fields are, first of all, philosophy, and we'll talk in a minute about biology. Now, philosophy, of course, is the foundational field of study for every area. You may have wondered at some point why most people, when they get a doctoral degree, whether it's in literature or biology or psychology or anything, they get a PhD, which stands for a Doctor of Philosophy. Why do you get a Doctor of Philosophy in chemistry? That doesn't make much sense. And the reasoning for that is that in the beginning, let's say when people started to make observations about the world and pay attention, philosophy and really theology as well, but philosophy was pretty much the study of anything and everything. And slowly over the hundreds of years, various fields broke off. And one of the first to break off was what we refer to generally as biology. But that, of course, later broke off into anatomy and physiology and chemistry and all of the other subfields. So we begin with philosophy, and I'm not going to give you a long riff on all the philosophers, but we do have to talk about several philosophers. And so let's go back 2,500 years to two really dominating figures, and they are Plato and Plato's student Aristotle. Now clearly Plato's teacher was Socrates, and so we've all heard of these names. These are three very, very important figures. But unfortunately, Socrates didn't actually write anything down. We have no books written by Socrates. Everything we know about Socrates was written down by others. But we certainly do have original works from Plato and Aristotle. And these two giants or titans of intellectual history are considered so for a very good reason. They made observations of everything you can imagine, or everything that was available for observation at that point. Clearly we didn't have microscopes and we didn't have MRIs. We couldn't look into the brain. We didn't know that bacteria and viruses existed. But these two figures asked questions about anything and came to really different answers. And so in some ways they stand for the two bedrock foundations, not only of philosophy, but pretty much of all science, and certainly of psychology. If I could give you an example of where they disagreed, you've all heard of the nature versus nurture question. And that question is basically, are we the way we are because we were born that way? In other words, by virtue of our genetic inheritance from our mother and father? Or do we become the way we are because we learn it through experience? So clearly, Plato pretty much followed the we are born that way. And Aristotle basically said we learn everything through experience. So Plato would be on the nature side, and Aristotle would be on the nurture side of the nature-nurture question. But we don't have time, but they ask questions about many other issues, certainly touching on psychology. How do we know what we know? Called epistemology. And so we begin with them. Another very important figure for all of science, but particularly for psychology, is the the French philosopher René Descartes. From Aristotle and Plato, they really are the foundation, and we could say the founders, along with Socrates, of ancient philosophy. Before these three philosophers came along, philosophy is collectively known as the pre-Socratics. So that would be the oldest philosophy. And then ancient philosophy pretty much started by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And then philosophy doesn't really change much. The medieval period has some additions, but along comes Descartes, and Descartes is considered the founder of modern philosophy, and for good reason. Descartes is famous for a phrase, ergo cogito ergo sum. That phrase in Latin, I'm sure you've heard, I think, therefore I am. And that may not strike you as very profound, and your reaction may be like, whoa, big deal. But up until Descartes, philosophy had gradually turned into a endeavor in which skepticism reigned. The skeptics, the skeptical philosophers basically had come to the conclusion that we can't trust sense perception, we really can't know anything definitively, and in some ways philosophy had reached a kind of a dead end. Because if we can't know anything definitively and we can't trust at least generally sense perception, then how in the world are we going to engage in science? Science, by definition, is empirical. It rests upon the belief, the assertion that through our observations, through our experiments, we can come to know, maybe not definitively, but we can come to have a fair amount of strong evidence that certain things are true and reliable, and we can use them in moving forward in building the structures of science on the foundation. And Descartes is key for that. So Descartes comes along and he decides to engage in a radical exercise of doubt. And if you want to read Descartes' Meditations, it's actually a pretty interesting book, in my opinion, for philosophy, which many of us would say runs toward the obscure and boring. But so Descartes said, I'm going to doubt everything. And so in his Meditations, he talks about doubting whether he is in his house, and whether he just had that meal, and whether the fire warming him in front of him is actually real. And indeed, we can doubt all that. He doubted everything. But eventually, when he kept doubting, he had to come to the conclusion that if he was doubting, then there must be a doubter. In other words, that he could doubt everything but the fact that he was doubting. So if we could take Descartes' phrase, I think, therefore I am, really the original version of that was, I doubt, therefore I must be a doubter. Now, he talks about a variety of thought experiments here. I can doubt that I'm doubting, but that still leaves me with the conclusion that if I doubt that I'm doubting, a doubter must still be behind the doubt that I'm doubting. And a doubter must still be behind the I doubt that 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 I'm doubting. And so in some way, René Descartes philosophically lays the foundation for science. Descartes also is famous for his embrace of dualism, separating the mind, the psyche, from the body, the soma. And in some ways, I'm sure you've heard of the mind-body problem, but in some ways that division is important because when we study the body, we can use principles, we can use techniques, we can use the scientific method to study the physical reality that the body represents and the physical reality of the world around us. But in studying the mind, remember the Greek word for mind is psyche, and it is synonymous with not only the mind but the soul or spirit. We're left with some difficulties and some problems, because how do we use techniques, i.e. the scientific method, to study physical phenomena and bring those techniques to bear on metaphysical phenomena, namely the mind or the soul or the spirit, or if you want to add to that, God or spirits or consciousness, these kinds of things. And so Descartes pretty much said that if we're going to apply correct investigative techniques, we need to separate physical from metaphysical. He's a pretty important character. Descartes is joined by another philosopher, this time an English or British philosopher of the 17th century, John Locke. And John Locke, also a famous empiricist, and Descartes can also represent two opposites of the nature-nurture controversy. So John Locke's famous phrase in Latin that he's known for is tabula rasa, which means, drum roll please, blank slate. And so Locke embraced Aristotle's idea that we learn everything. In other words, the nurture side of the nature-nurture question. Whereas Descartes would have embraced the nature side, or the Platonic idea that no, we are born with our knowledge, and both of them would have said that in some ways learning is really relearning. It's remembering kind of what we already had within us. So this is our philosophical foundation, and we'll come back to that in a second. If we go to the other area that psychology, or the other parent of the field of psychology, biology or physiology, clearly there were plenty of people studying the Bible or the body, or asking questions about the body, and from very early on. But the technology was limited to cutting open dead bodies. We couldn't really observe live bodies. We didn't have all of the things we take for granted when we study physiology, biology, chemistry. And so the people that studied physiology and biology, kind of did discover things like, the circulatory systems of humans and animals, and the respiratory system and the reproduction system. You can discover all that by dissecting bodies. But when it came to trying to understand the brain, not even the mind, if we divide those two, they were, shall I say, entertaining in their craziness. But we should also say that they were, smart in their wrongness, if I could put it that way. They assumed, because they studied the body, that the brain was probably like a little mini body, in that just like our bodies have livers and lungs and gallbladders, whatever the gallbladder does, and hearts and digestive systems, each specializing in a capability, and together the whole works smoothly. So the brain probably could be divided up into little mini organs, if you will. And so here's an example of a drawing in which we have our brain in front of us. And I don't know if you can see this, but clearly all the way up at the top here we have firmness, and clearly they were wrong, but they were wrong in a kind of brilliant way. As we get beyond the 1700s into the 18 and 1900s, the field of biology and science clearly grows by leaps and bounds. First of all, with the invention of the telescope and then the microscope, our understanding of disease slowly, the fields of physiology and biology and anatomy and chemistry and all those things grow and in turn split off. So in the late 1800s, we have philosophy and we have physiology or biology, and those two fields, if you will, are the parents of the baby we call psychology. And so the founder of psychology is considered to be Wilhelm Wundt. He was a German physiologist, and he got interested in, shall we say, questions that were more psychological than physiological, and he wrote the first kind of textbook in 1874, and but opened the first psychology lab at the University of Leipzig in eastern Germany, and that is considered to be the official founding year of this field that you're studying, psychology. So if you do the math, we're about 130, 140 years old officially. Clearly, unofficially, psychology, in other words, the study of scientific study of behavior and mental processes, was around long before that. So Wundt is a German, and he has some American students that come and study with him. And so one of those students, very importantly, along with Wundt, founds the field of structuralism. Wundt it isn't really important for our story of the history of psychology, because psychology really moves from Europe across the pond, shall I say, over to the United States. And so we have Edward Tishner. I guess these guys all look the same. Their little round glasses and their big serious beard. But Edward Tishner and Wundt, as a kind of a pre-founder, start an area of psychology which is called structuralism. Now, Wundt would have seen psychology as a field which asks and attempts to answer the following question: what is the best way to get at or measure these mental processes? In other words, what's going on in our brain? Now, Tishner took it one step further. Tishner and the other structuralists took it one step further, and they said, well, if the body has a structure, we have our bones and our muscles and our internal organs and so on and so forth. What is the structure of the brain? Or maybe we could rephrase the question in this way: what are the structures of conscious experience? Now, the problem with structuralism is it didn't last very long, because they used, or at least Tishner and his American colleagues used, a method called introspection, in which they would seek to inquire of people in an introspective way. In other words, ask people to go inside their mind and report on the structures. Well, imagine yourself coming into a lab and sitting in a comfortable chair and getting comfortable and being asked, okay, so close your eyes and think about what are the structures of your mind. Well, of course, they didn't get anything. People said all kinds of different things, and there was no systematic organization to that. And so in some ways, the method that the structuralists use, introspection, really led to their early demise. And they were around 20, 25 years, and then they kind of disappeared. There was another group that began while the structuralists were around, and they took a different approach. They were called the functionalists, and the founder of functionalism was a very prominent American philosopher named William James. And so he was a philosopher first and then became a psychologist as well. But William James would have would have seen psychology as the field that tries to ask and answer the questions that you see in front of you. What are the functions, that's why it was called functionalism, of behavior and mental experiences in allowing us to deal with our lives, not only day to day, but in the big picture. And secondly, whatever functions we discover, how can we apply this to better improve the human experience? Now, as you see in the slide in front of you, William James relied kind of intellectually on the work of Charles Darwin, the famous founder of the theory of evolution, and particularly his book written in and published in 1859, about 40 years earlier, 45 years earlier, on the origin of species. And I'm sure you know that Darwin's famous question was that survival of the fittest, and people misinterpret that, but the idea here is that organisms that are well adapted physically to their environment are more likely to survive and go on and breed, and therefore pass on their peculiar and particular genetic configuration. So that survival of the fittest is simply a way of simply saying how is adaptability, physical adaptability in this particular case, because animals aren't sitting around talking about philosophy and they're not worried about taking exams, but how does one's physical adaptability in a particular environment, that's crucial, contribute toward survival, which again maximizes the chance that your genetics are passed on. Well, James took this, Darwin's approach, and simply said, well, how do our psychological and mental attributes in our environment allow us to adapt well or moderately or poorly, and to what extent does that allow us, if you will, to either struggle along and survive, or to thrive in our environments. So it's an interesting idea. If I could just give a quick example of this, you and I take for granted that to survive in the modern world in which we live in, we really, really need technological skills. We need to know how to use various platforms, the computer, the internet, our phones. It becomes really, really difficult to function, adapt, if you will, thrive in the modern environment if we have no technological skills at all. Years ago, my father-in-law, he was in his 80s, and he decided that he was going to buy a computer and learn how to use the computer, and so he recruited me to be his computer tutor. Well, I went down to where he lived and gave him his first lesson, and it was to say the least frustrating, because literally he had no idea what to do at all. I had to tell him, okay, open up the computer or turn it on. He said, how do you do that? And so the funny story about that is I thought after about 2 hours that I had taught him how to at least to use email. We created an email account for him, and I thought that he could at least send email. Well, a couple of months later he said to me, "Why don't you reply to my emails? I never get any replies from anybody." And I said, "Well, Cliff, I've never received an email from you." And he said, "I've sent you a bunch." So next time I saw him, I went on his laptop, and I saw that he had about 200 drafts in his email. He didn't know that he should press send. And when I said, "Well, Cliff, you have to press send," and he said, "Well, you never said that." And he was probably right. I just assumed, I guess, because it's just the air we breathe with our modern use of technology, that, man, anybody should know when you write an email, you got to press send. You can't just write it and then close the computer and hope for the best. But perhaps that's a good example of how a skill that we take for granted is very, very important for us to psychologically adapt in the environment we're in. Well, the functionalists were so successful at defining psychology. That's really what psychology became is discovering how the various human capabilities that we have function. And as we know more and more, how can we, if you will, improve on those to allow us to function better? How can we apply what we know to teaching, making our schools better, to making our companies more efficient, to making jury selection better, to designing products that are more intuitive and useful. So functionalism didn't last very long simply because they were too successful. They pretty much defined the whole field of psychology. Now along comes two very important figures, and we'll talk about them later in the semester at great length, but going back over to Europe, Sigmund Freud in Vienna, Austria, comes along, and he is the founder of psychoanalysis, or the psychodynamic approach, and really in some ways defined all of psychology in Europe. And psychoanalysis or psychodynamic approach, the Freudian approach, certainly came to the United States, but was much more influential in Europe. And so from the 1920s to about the 1960s, psychology was on the one hand Freud, who dominated in Europe, and clearly we also get an important, very important field or aspect of psychology which emerges, which we've called the behaviorists. Now, behaviorism began in Russia with a character named Pavlov, Ivan Pavlov, and you certainly have heard of him. He's the man of salivating dog fame. But as with psychology early on, behaviorism in some ways, I won't say came to America, but certainly was dominated by American psychologists, and two in particular, John B. Watson at Harvard University and B.F. Skinner also at Harvard University. So from the 1920s until the 1960s, psychology was really in two camps. The behaviorists on the one hand, who some people said, studied dogs and rats and pigeons, and Freud and the various followers of Freud, Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, and many others, who really were in some ways not doing research per se, but speculating, engaging in speculating and theorizing on what makes human beings human. I had a professor in college that went to Harvard University, and she said when she went there, she said that the psychology building was composed of pretty much Freudians and behaviorists, and there was actually two elevators on opposite sides of the building, and she claimed that one elevator was where the behaviorists came in. They took that elevator, and the Freudians took the other elevator. And if you were a Freudian, you didn't take the behaviorist elevator, and vice versa. I don't know if that's true. That was her story. But it's not until the 1960s that two really radically new perspectives come along in psychology, and they really change the field. The field of psychology that you and I are a part of really is a very different one than the one that existed before the 1960s. So along come the humanists and two American psychologists, Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, and their contribution was pretty much huge. They looked at the behaviorists who they saw as, again, focusing on only behavior and spending an inordinate amount of time studying, again, pigeons and rats and so on and so forth. On the other hand, the Freudians studying not just behavior, but speculating about all kinds of things, psyches and ids and egos and superegos and collective unconsciouses and so on and so forth, pretty much spending their time speculative. And so the humanists really want to rescue psychology and make it about pretty much everybody else, the normal, every day-to-day experience of being a human being. And not to talk about extremely crazy people and rats and pigeons, but really the stuff that's a part and important, a part of our day and important to us. Why am I here? Is there meaning in my life? How do I feel about myself? How can I be all I can be? How can I decide to make changes to maximize my enjoyment and productivity in life? The importance of the individual. And so their emphasis really rescued psychology in some ways. I'm exaggerating that a little bit. And made it a study, brought it back to the study of practical everyday functionalism and applying it to life and applying it to not just the life of obscure and populations, but everyday people like you and I. So they changed everything. And also in the 60s, another approach which we'll call the cognitive approach, which really comes on the scene because of our increasing insight into the brain and how the brain works and genetics and huge leaps in understanding of the processes of thinking and memory and sensation and perception. And again, we'll get to that as we go through our semester. We're still in some ways in the cognitive revolution because as the field of psychology takes on more and more the understanding of the brain, really we're in a revolution of what we've called neuroscience. And in some ways, psychology perhaps in the future will be really neuroscience and applied neuroscience, because the number of research findings and applied findings that we've gleaned and gained through our understanding of how the brain works and how amazing this organ that all of us take for granted works. We're still in the midst of that. We could add, I don't have a slide of this, we could add one further maybe mini change, and perhaps that's the addition about 15 or 20 years ago of what's been called positive psychology. The people that founded positive psychology are all still around. They're still with us. Seligman is at the University of Pennsylvania and others. But positive psychology came on the scene again with a humanistic-like attempt to steer the ship of psychology into a different direction. Their critique is that psychology has focused for so long, again, importantly, on understanding behavior and trying to fix or trying to bring fixes to bear when, for instance, psychopathology emerges, anxiety or depression or schizophrenia. Positive psychology, as the name would imply, simply says, how can we use what we've learned in psychology and what we will continue to learn, not just to help us, to bring us back to, say, normal, but to help us to thrive, to help us to go beyond everyday experience and enhance the human experience to, as the humanists would have say, not just to be what we can be, but to be all we could be, to pursue, let me put the word in quotes, happiness or a greater productivity or a greater sense of meaning and purpose in our lives. So that's our quick version of the history of psychology. Thank you so much for listening, and we will quote unquote see you in the next lecture. Thank you.